Mr. Lewis.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield my time to Mr. Doggett.
Thank you. It has become very clear that this hearing, this markup, is not about tax reform. It's about a political life preserver. This whole procedure is totally out of order. We were presented with the final version of 425 pages of changes to complex tax law on Friday. And now we are given an additional, 30 plus pages, 33 pages to be precise, of changes to that amendment. We have no score or estimate of what these changes will cost. They are bundled together in a fashion that is not consistent with the operation of this committee. It requires, particularly on the international rules, some time to evaluate how those intersect with the provisions in the bill. One has to wonder if Mr. Gary Cohn, as the lead person at the White House, had a hand in the development of these provisions. Since we have been meeting, additional disclosures have come out as a part of the Paradise Papers about the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being handled in offshore accounts throughout the islands of the Atlantic and the Caribbean, that in some cases there'll be no tax charge on them at all. And with the slightest change in these international rules, which are included here, it's not possible without some review, and some review by people, frankly, who may have more expertise and understanding of the tax rules and regulations than some of the members of the committee have an opportunity to review and do some independent evaluation of those. It is clear that the majority does not feel they can pass their legislation by following the normal procedure, and that this amendment is nothing more than a series of patches on the bill to try to secure some additional support. These international base erosion rules may be nothing more than more erosion. What we need to do is to be able to evaluate those, and we are not even accommodated with a few minutes to discuss and review and look at the intersection between these 33 pages and the 425 pages that we were so recently presented. On the carried interest issue, for example, the chairman's position has been in the original bill, and this is one of the few parts of this bundle we can analyze, that having a holding period of a year is sufficient. And now, apparently, in this, he has reformed that provision by extending it all the way to 3 years. The only problem with that is that most of the funds that I'm familiar with, and we've had some great ones out of Austin, Texas, extend for 10 years or more. And so apparently this is nothing but a gloss to protect carried interest, to protect a loophole and a special provision that accords to some hedge fund managers the opportunity to pay much less in the way of taxes than other people pay. This is the very loophole that President Trump, as a candidate, promised he would eliminate. And instead of eliminating it, they first had the facade of a one-year holding period. Now they have expanded it with a little broader facade in a way that will not change carried interest. Of course, if we had a score and an analysis even by the Joint Tax Committee of this amendment, we could determine whether or not it represented any genuine change. There are a host of other provisions in this measure that are worthy of further consideration, but it is perhaps more the omission than the commission. Now, we heard for the first time a few minutes ago, in response to questions from Mr. Thompson, that something might be done about disaster relief. I don't see that, Mr. Thompson, anywhere in these 33 pages. I must say I shared your concern about why it was we were providing relief 1 week and taking it away a few weeks later. And you were told that, don't worry, there'll be some help coming down the road. Well, it's not in these pages. I don't know what other votes they think they may need to secure on the floor to add something about that later, but it,
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask to strike the last word.
Mr. Doggett, do you wish to be recognized to strike the last
do.
word? Thank you.
And so whether it is disaster relief or any number of other provisions that are in this bill or not in this bill, we need to consider that this amendment, for example, does nothing about the adoption tax credit. The provisions in the original 425 pages had the effect of taking away over the course of the bill a little more than $2 billion from the teachers of America. Teachers who are in schools that have been hard-pressed by reduced budgets and who bring their own supplies to the classroom and are currently entitled to deduct up to $500. The response to that provision in our law is to say to all those teachers, and there are thousands of them that take that $500 deduction and probably contribute much more than $500 to enrich their classrooms, that's no longer available, that there is no commitment to supporting our teachers across America in enriching their classrooms. I remember long ago when my wife was a first grade teacher, it seemed that every new school year we had another pickup truckload of materials to take back to the classroom. And as I talk to teachers in Texas, I find very much the same experience. What's wrong with giving those teachers a $500 deduction when many of them are spending far more than that for their classroom? I heard our colleagues talk about the fact that, you know, what they're going to do? They're going to give the money back to the people, let them keep it, and they can make a choice with what they want to do with their money. Well, you know, I think these people in California who had their homes burnt down, their choice, I suppose, that they're being allowed is they can either use it to rebuild their home or they can abandon their home. That's the choice that the fire imposed. The student who has a significant amount of student debt who will now be denied the right to deduct the interest on that student debt. That student doesn't have much of a choice. The bank's not giving them a choice to not pay for the interest on the debt. The question is whether or not we will encourage those students and recognize this is a time in America when the burden of student debt is even affecting seniors who either had their own debt that remains there or they provided help to their children or their grandchildren, and they have huge amounts of debt. They need to be able to deduct the interest on that debt. You can go down one provision after another, and you will see that relief is not accorded, and I would yield to the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you. You know, when you go down this list, you can see lobbyists at work, every single one of these. Carried interest is just one example, and you can look at each of these. You talk about special interests, and you want to rid the code of special interests. Mr. Doggett, thank you for yielding, and I think all of us on the Democratic side can just look through these and just see what lobbyist has been in to see you guys.
Well, I think a little earlier in the debate, in response to a question from Mr. Larson about finding out the details of what's in this amendment, he was told by the chairman, quote, "The gentleman can review the amendment when it is offered." It's clear that it's been offered and considered by many people, perhaps on K Street, perhaps the many people who've gathered here today, but certainly the members of this committee have not been accorded the courtesy, even on issues in which they're keenly involved, of looking at the bundle of provisions that is in this amendment. And we know that many of the issues that have been raised by our colleagues this afternoon as improvements that are needed to this bill, that they have not been considered or included. All of this, whatever has been added here, has of course been added with borrowed money. To the extent that this involves additional cost, it's all being borrowed and added to the $2.3 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. There's some suggestion that there's some new savings, Mr. Larson, from moving to a chain CPI. All of that is nothing but a precedent for weakening Social Security. They want to do it here so that they can come back to our Social Security recipients who see so little coming in additional cost of living benefit in January, and this will be the precedent for saying to them they don't even get the little bit of cost of living increase they get now. So for all these reasons, I would urge my colleagues to vote a firm no against this amendment and all that it represents in rejecting the traditions of this committee.